Okay, so we are here, another episode of JagCast. I am the editor-in-chief of the Mesquite, Oscar Gonzalez. Jerry Quijano's behind there. Yes, looking on great. We have a special guest today. It's Michael Drudge. He's a board member of the San Antonio Pro chapter of the SPJ, and he's been helping us out here at the Mesquite newsroom with our reporters and reporting class. So, Michael, thanks for sticking around after the class.
Thank you, Oscar. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, we've had you quite a bit. So ever since I started coming here, which was fall 2014, you've sort of came in, visited the class, talk about the scholarship for the Pro chapter that the Pro chapter does. Mm-hmm. How is it working with students? I mean, you yourself are a professional, been around for a while when it comes to journalism, but I mean, when you're seeing these new students that are learning it for the first time, mm-hmm. learning AP style, how is it when you talk with them?
You know, I'm finding, I must say, a surprisingly high caliber of student journalists on this campus. Mm-hmm. Higher than I was expecting when Professor Moore invited me to come and do this. I think you all are, for such a small fledgling program, you're making some remarkable strides, and I see a lot of talent out there in your newsroom and a lot of enthusiasm, which is really important as well. Yeah.
So tell me about your story. Well, tell us about your story, because it's an interesting story in regards to like how you got into journalism, and also, I mean, where you were working, and because it wasn't just your conventional working for your daily newspaper. You were out and about traveling.
Well, we'll start with my education. I first came to San Antonio to attend Trinity University in 1969. And I was intending to be a biology major. Yeah. And I did pretty good in my biology classes, but I was miserable at chemistry and stuff like that. And I realized,
you're not the only one.
That my dream had been to maybe become a marine biologist, but it would require getting a PhD. And I just knew I didn't have the chemistry and things were going to hurt my career aspirations. And I had always written for student newspapers. Even I grew up in Houston, and even at the junior high school level in high school, I was always involved in a student newspaper. And journalism was kind of a fallback. I always found it, I enjoyed it, and it came naturally to me. So I decided to switch majors, and I had a very good professor, counselor there named Dave Burkett, who helped me a lot and mentored me through that program. When I graduated, he was able to help me get an interview at the Express. Then the Express and the News were two different newspapers.
So that was
the
Express
and
was
the News
in the morning, and the Light?
That's right. There were three daily newspapers in San Antonio. The Express published in the morning, and the News and the Light were competed in the afternoon.
Okay.
And this was in December 1973. I got a job offer from the Express, and the managing editor was named Bill Wagner, and he said, "Come in, I'll hire you." It was the middle of December. He said, "Just come in after New Year's. I'll see you on the 3rd of January or whatever. Okay. Well, I'll put you to work." So a couple of days or 3 or 4 days after I had that interview, Rupert Murdoch flew to San Antonio and bought the Express and News newspaper from a company. The company that owned it before was called Hart Hanks. Uh-huh. And so I called that guy up and I said, "Mr. Wagner, this purchase of the paper, will that affect my job offer?" And he said, no problem. We still need you. Come on in. I'll see you on the 3rd of January. So I went in, anticipating being put on the Express as a general assignments news reporter. And Wagner said, "We've got a different plan for you now. I want you to be in the sports department, and we want you to write, cover youth sports from the junior high school level and Little League and all that sort of thing." Mm-hmm. The idea was that Murdoch wanted every kid's name in the newspaper so that all of his parents, grandparents, uncles, and aunts would go out and buy a newspaper.
It's a smart move. Can't deny it.
But the sports department at that time, the chief editor was a guy named Dan Cook. He's a legend here in San Antonio.
I remember back when he was
on TV too.
Right. Yeah, Ken's Five.
Yeah,
Ken's Fives for a long time. Well, Cook and the people working under him, the senior editors, they didn't like this idea too much at all because it was going to take away space in the sports section away from the Dallas Cowboys and the Texas Longhorns and all of that. So they kind of resisted and basically had me doing the same stuff that all the other sports writers were doing. But I was a low guy on the totem pole, so I covered some high school basketball and things like that.
And was that at all an interest of yours prior to that?
I've always been kind of interested in sports as a fan, but I'd never aspired to actually go into sports writing or sports casting as a career.
So like a lot of journalists, you were forced into something you didn't know right off the bat.
Precisely. I didn't. Yeah. There was a case where during spring college baseball season, we had stringers around the state who would phone in scores and stuff. So I took the notes from a guy phoning in the box score of a Texas Longhorns versus Baylor baseball game.
Right. And
he didn't give me, nor did I ask for the positions of the players. I had Jones, 4 at bats, no hits, 2 strikeouts, whatever, But I didn't have what position he played, shortstop, right. First base. And when I turned in the box score, the editor was really, really mad.
Was that Dan Cook? Was he mad at you?
It was his assistant named Carl O'Quinn.
Okay.
It wasn't Cook himself. But I quickly learned that I forgot to get the guy's phone number who called me up. I really blew it.
Oh, geez. So what happened? So in the case of that, because obviously you can't look it up on the internet at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, were you just...
What we did was O'Quinn had media guides had been printed up by the colleges, and he was going through and matching up.
Trying to find them.
Yeah. Jones, I know he's a shortstop, and this one's a first base. He went through and figured it out, but it was a hassle.
But he let you have it.
He let me know I should never ever do that again, and I didn't. But I must say that I did end up covering one youth sports event that was quite consequential. Mm-hmm. There was a young girl who wanted to get onto Little League Baseball here in San Antonio, and that was the first time that
back
then girls didn't play on Little League boys baseball teams.
Right.
And so this girl, her father went to court and sued the Little League to get his daughter onto the team, and I broke the story.
Oh, wow.
And the same editor, Carl O'Quinn, helped me, mentored me getting through that story, and when I had it together, he went into the meeting where they were putting together the front page and said, we need to put this on page 1. Wow. And so that was my first page 1 byline.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was an ongoing story. The girl finally did get on the baseball team, but it took some legal action. Wow. Yeah.
So how was it sort of working in that day when, the papers were the primary source of information? Even, TV was sort of kind of secondary in most cases.
There was strong competition between both actually inside the company. The Express and the News competed with each other, and then the News with the Light, and the Express also with the Light.
Right.
It was a time of certainly in San Antonio, kind of a great time of competition in journalism. I must say that Murdoch introduced some pretty sensationalistic tactics, glaring headlines that were only sort of close to, sometimes on the edge of this true story, just to try to grab headlines and sell papers. I ended up for a while, after about 6 months in the sports department, they moved me over to the News, and I worked overnight as a police reporter, and I sat in a car. It's still, it's at a Jack in the Box at Elmira and San Pedro. It's 24-hour-a-day Jack in the Box downtown.
Okay.
And it's right where, from there, all the entrances to all the freeways. You can go anywhere. It's like the geographic center of Bexar County. Mm-hmm. And we had this big car full of police scanners, and I would go racing off to any car wreck or fire or murder.
Yeah, it's funny. Jacob Beltran, he was a former editor for Mesquite, so he's at the Express News, and he does the crime beat. Mm-hmm. And so with him, it's kind of funny because he has a scanner, but it's now a portable one, and he carries it on him.
Yeah.
And he walks around the newsroom or wherever, and he could hear just, got 420,
Mm-hmm.
You could hear him all around, and he's over there getting
You can
water.
put it on your iPhone now.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So you were doing it there because then you had to haul off to wherever the crime was happening.
That's right. We would go racing down there. There was usually myself. There would be a photographer from the Light. They didn't keep an overnight reporter. I took photos too. I did.
Okay.
I reported and took photos of all these incidents. And then there were these kind of ghoulish fellows who were photographers who took photographs of car wrecks for insurance companies.
Oh.
And they would take all the skid marks and everything so that they could figure out who was at fault and who was speeding and that sort of thing for legal insurance.
So ghoulish,
ghoulish in a way that it's kind of an odd way to make a living, if you ask me. But so at the time I was doing all of this, I didn't really enjoy being a police reporter all that much. A lot of it was, pretty difficult stuff to deal with, but it was great experience. It really was, especially when you're working all by yourself and you have to make sure you get everything right and get everybody's name spelled right and take the photographs and
So you'd be out there, where all these other, so everybody would kind of, if an accident happened, like all these people would kind of be there. You basically,
race off like in a convoy down the freeway.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah. And we'd finish that. Sometimes you'd be at a scene of something and you'd hear a call to go off somewhere else, or you'd finish that and you'd go back to the Jack in the Box and hang around waiting for the next thing to happen. Yeah.
No.
After doing the police beat for a while, I did that for maybe close to a year, I suppose, and then they moved me to the courthouse, and I started covering. I started wearing a coat and tie, and going to cover trials, and
so you're still like in your mid to early 20s.
Oh yes, I was. That's right. I was just shy of 23 years old when I started working at the Express. Yeah.
Okay.
So.
And at the courthouse, any particular cases that you were?
There was one case that was very, very infamous here in Texas, a trial of a man named Elmer Wayne Henley. There had been a series of disappearances and of young men in the Houston, Galveston area.
Okay.
And what happened was there was a ringleader who was kidnapping young men and raping them and murdering them and burying their bodies on a place called High Island just north of Galveston. Mm-hmm. And this guy Henley was working with him, attracting boys to come and fall into their lyre, as it were. And so at one point Henley killed the guy. The leader of the thing was named Dean Corll. Mm-hmm. So Henley killed him, went to the police, and they broke the whole thing, and they put Henley on trial for his complicity in the thing. And his trial was moved here to Bexar County.
Wow,
that was a big case, very big case. And his mother would come, and she would sit on the hallway outside most of the time. Mm-hmm. And I interviewed her at one point.
Yeah,
and that was pretty an emotional time.
Okay.
There was one of the editors. This was an example of what things could go wrong in the Murdoch era here. One of the editors at the News assigned a young intern reporter to call up the families of the jurors and ask the family members how they felt about their family member being on the jury. And the judge found out about it and blew up. It almost became a mistrial, and it was a big deal.
Yeah, that's wow.
That's something that's not ethical. You just really can't.
That's not legal.
Not legal. It's jury tampering, possibly, and all. It was just a really bad situation.
Wow. So Rupert Murdoch would really get in there in regards.
He would come. He didn't.
But he would.
He had his own people on the ground from Australia, who were here full time working and supervising the production. But Murdoch did come and visit San Antonio from time to time. It was his very first acquisition in the United States. Wow. The very first news property that he bought here.
Wow.
Yeah, and I had heard of him, and I knew he was a big publisher in Australia. But I had, at the time, I never could have imagined that his empire would grow as big as it is today.
Yeah, that's weird that it all started here.
Very remarkable.
It's like we should take the blame.
Oscar always has to see it in the negative way.
So let me just say that after finishing my stint at the Express and the News, I threw in my lot with one of my Trinity classmates to start an alternative weekly newspaper, kind of like the San Antonio Current.
Right.
We never had enough funding to really get it going very well. It lasted for about a year and it folded. But I enjoyed it very much. It was a lot of fun to do. And at that point, I was, when it went bankrupt, I was broke and I needed work badly. And another Trinity colleague of mine was working at a little paper in East Texas called the Orange Leader. Orange is a city right on the border with Louisiana, near Beaumont. And they needed a copy editor, and I needed work. So when they paid pretty well for a small town paper, they paid as much as I was making at the Express News. So I went over there, and I did that for about a year, and saved up my money. And then one more of my Trinity student colleagues. So that's 4 connections out of Trinity.
Always helps
for
have
jobs.
Connections.
That's, and your colleagues, anybody who's a student here watching this should remember, keep these people you're studying with, remain friends with them because you all can network with each other. Anyway, I ended up working in Mexico City at an English language newspaper there. And
so you jumped from Little Orange, Texas.
Little Orange, Texas to Mexico City. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting jump.
Yeah. And I had gone to visit my friend just on a vacation, and I met the editor of the paper, and we chatted a little bit. And I just went back to Orange and put it out of my mind. He called me up a few weeks later and said, "Why don't you come down here and work for me?" And I said, well, maybe. How much do you pay? He said, "I'm going to pay you $200. I thought he meant $200 a week, which back then was okay. Mm-hmm. So I said, okay, fine. Let me close up my affairs. Maybe give me some time. Maybe in a month or so I can go. He said, that's okay, fine. So I finished my job in Orange, moved down to Mexico City, and went to work. And it turned out he was paying me $200 a month.
That's a big difference. So let's talk about this. I mean, so you're from Houston.
Yeah.
You go to work in San Antonio. You end up in Orange, Texas,
mm-hmm.
and then you drive to Mexico City. I mean, how does that even work? I mean, especially at that time. This was like 76 or so?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, it's just one of those things that kind of boggles my mind in that it's like, hey, did you even speak Spanish?
I spoke some Spanish. I'd studied Spanish in high school in Houston. In college, I studied Russian, believe it or not.
Okay.
But I had enough to get my Spanish back up a little bit. But I was working at an English language newspaper. I was just doing copy editing. I wasn't out on the streets interviewing people for stories to be published. But
it's still, even though you're working in English, it's still Mexico City.
City, and I have to live and deal with the culture and all that. Eat and get a place to live and all of that. Yeah, I understand. I did take some refresher courses in Spanish.
Okay.
And there was, they had the American Embassy sponsored a rather big education class for Mexicans trying to learn English, but there was a small program associated with it for expats like me who were in Mexico to study Spanish. And it was very cheap, and I was able to do that. I could do that in the morning time and then work at the paper and get my Spanish back up to speed.
Okay.
But I had friends and colleagues at the newspaper who helped me get a place to live and got my feet on the ground and oriented me, and I hung out with them. And
so you're able to survive with $200 a month?
I got by because they had an odd system there where, let's say the arts editor, they were very generous with vacation time. Mm-hmm. The arts editor might take off for 6 weeks to go off on vacation. So if you came in and did his arts pages, you would get his salary on top of your $200 a month. So pretty soon you do that, a few things like that, they had these angles to where you could actually save some money. You didn't have to spend every penny or every peso, as it were, on your life. So, and I did that for a couple of years at that paper, and then a friend of mine working at the paper, again a network connection, told me that UPI, the United Press International, the bureau there was looking for a journalist to work and be an editor and do some reporting. And I went and interviewed the news editor at that bureau, and he hired me. Mm-hmm. He hired me part-time to begin with, so I continued working at the English newspaper, working part-time at UPI. And within a few months, he had a full-time, or approval for a full-time job for me. And so I left the newspaper and just did UPI full-time.
So what kind of stories were you doing both at the paper and then UPI?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what were the beats, or
what happened was we had some beat reporters at the newspaper there. Mm-hmm. I was never one of them. I would work with them sometimes, helping, and again, I did a little bit of everything, working with the business editor and the sports editor and the arts editor and the travel editor and stuff like that. I wrote some travel stories.
But this was about
but primarily in the country of Mexico.
Okay.
It was based in Mexico City. The newspaper was owned by Novedades, which is a big Spanish newspaper. Mm-hmm. And we would get sometimes just translate stories that were going to be in Novedades and put them into English and put them in our English newspaper too. Mm-hmm. And the newspaper circulated not just in Mexico City, but all around the country. Especially it was focused a lot on visiting tourists, and we sold a lot of papers in Acapulco and Mazatlan and places where there were significant American expat communities or a lot of tourists.
Yeah. And then UPI, what kind of stories were there? Well,
UPI covered it was a regional bureau. It was based in Mexico City and covered everything down to Panama, from the Texas border to Panama. And so at the beginning, I was an editor basically in the newsroom. We would cover things like I would take in dictation from stringers in Central America. Also, we would cover the major political developments in Mexico City itself, or another example of a story. There was a big oil blowout in the Gulf of Mexico. Pemex well blew out, and up until the BP tragedy in the Gulf of Mexico, up until that time, that thing in Mexico had been the worst, the biggest oil spill in world history. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Things like that. That would cover.
And was this? I mean, this was still during late '70s. So was there?
It was right at the time when the Nicaragua Civil War was.
That's what I was going to say.
The Sandinista. I went to work there. Somoza was leading. He was the president of Nicaragua, but the Sandinista guerrilla movement had really started kicking off. Wow. And I didn't go to Nicaragua. I was too junior on the totem pole, but we did have I did work with other more senior UPI reporters. And they gave me my consolation prizes. I went to Honduras a lot.
Oh, okay.
Because my senior editor, he didn't want to go. He didn't like going to Honduras, so he gave that to me, and I became the Honduras expert on the desk. But I worked in Mexico City for UPI. I'm trying to think now, about 3, 4, 5 years. And then they had an opening in El Salvador, 1983. And I took that and became the El Salvador bureau chief. Nicaragua had already fallen to the Sandinistas. Mm-hmm. El Salvador was in civil war, and I went and covered that for UPI. I was there for 2 years. Yeah.
Wasn't there a movie about El Salvador and
more than one? Yeah.
Yeah, there was. It was when I was a kid. So, but I mean, I remember a movie. I think it was with James Woods.
James Woods, it was called Salvador.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then,
there was another one about Nicaragua, or at least one or two, also.
Yeah.
In Nicaragua during the Sandinista revolution, there was an American journalist murdered. You know about that? I can't remember his name. He was with one of the. He was like. His name escapes me now.
Right.
He was, I believe, with ABC. and he had been sent down to cover the war. He ran into a patrol of Nicaraguan National Guard, the Somoza forces, who his crew was able to film him. He's got his hands up, and they have him kneel down on the ground, and they just shoot him. And that was broadcast about 1 million times here in the United States on all the networks, and it was the beginning. That was the straw that broke the camel's back for U.S. aid to Somoza. They cut him off, and President Carter ended any military relationship with him, and he fell about 6 weeks later.
So how was it dealing with dealing with these revolutions that were happening? I mean, it's something that really doesn't happen as of late, but I mean, let's count the Arab Spring. But I mean, dealing with that at that time, I mean, how was that environment?
Well, pretty tense, because you could cover both sides. El Salvador is very small. It's the size of Massachusetts. Yeah. You can drive from one end to the other in half a day.
Right.
And so you can be covering, you could go out to some town where the guerrillas are attacking the village in the morning, and in the afternoon you're in San Salvador for a news conference with the president of the country. So you cover, in a lot of wars, reporters would be on like one side or the other. Mm-hmm. In Vietnam, reporters didn't hang out with the Viet Cong. No. They covered the Americans. Right. They were on the American side. They flew in the American helicopters. But in this situation, we would be on both sides, covering both sides at the same time. And so there was
any close calls while covering both sides?
I was in occasional situations where you had to be really careful. Yeah. There was one time when they had the scariest part of working in El Salvador for me was the presence of these death squads. They were aligned with the military. They were aligned with the economic powers of the country, and they would commonly kidnap with people they suspected were communists and take them out and shoot them, dump their bodies in a field somewhere. One time, and they were very, very critical of the American press, because they considered us to be too. If you were not totally in favor of what they were doing, or you reported on the bad things they were doing, you were the enemy. Yeah. And they dumped we worked at a hotel called the Camino Real. All the press corps had a office space there. And it worked out very well, because if we had visiting correspondents, they could sleep in the hotel and have their office there and not have to go out if there were times when there were curfews and what have you. So anyway, I was working at this hotel, and the death squads one day dumped a body in the parking lot where we all had our cars, with a sign around the neck saying, "Journalists tell the truth," in Spanish. Periodista dice la verdad. Yeah, and one of my colleagues called it the calling card cadaver. It's kind of funny in a macabre way,
Yeah,
So,
really.
And those kind of things would happen. And
so how was it for you? Because you're still a young man.
Relative. I'm 65.
Well, at the time you were also a young man.
At that time I was.
So
yes.
you're still a young man.
That's right. And I was there with my wife. We didn't have any kids at the time, but my wife lived with me in El Salvador. So she's from Mexico City.
Yeah. You had your whole life ahead of you. Yeah. Was this sort of adrenaline? Like you're excited? Was it sort of just ho hum everyday type of work?
No.
Is. How was it?
You can get kind of hooked on the adrenaline of it.
Is that what it was?
You can do it. Yeah, I think as a reporter and as a bureau chief, I had a lot of responsibilities that kept me from getting really close to a lot of the action. Right. The ones who really got the adrenaline rush were the photographers, who had to go every day and photograph this stuff. And but early on, senior colleagues of mine, mentors of mine said, be careful. There's nothing, no stories worth getting hurt for. do the best you can, but we really, we need you to be there in one piece and take care of yourself. So
it was still wasn't your sort of everyday kind of reporting job. I mean,
No.
There was still sort of a bit of a rush there, but I mean, you were definitely not always in the thick of it.
That's correct.
Okay.
And from El Salvador, when I was there for UPI, I stayed pretty much. I covered some stuff going on in Guatemala. Now and again, there'd be a coup or something. It was pretty easy to drive from San Salvador.
Did anybody make jokes about that? Just like every other country. Oh, is there a coup this week or next week? No one. I mean, it seemed like it was happening.
There were a lot of
With all the communism and everything being spread around, it just seemed like that whole Central America was whoosh.
Yeah. After a couple of years in El Salvador, UPI started going bankrupt and cutting our salaries and all kinds of stuff. So I started looking around for another job because I don't have much of a future here. I don't think that this company is going to last. And a colleague reminded me of that the Voice of America was looking for a regional correspondent based in Central America.
Mm-hmm.
So I inquired. The wife of one of my friends at UPI worked for VOA. He was a photographer for UPI, and his wife was a correspondent at VOA. And she said, they're still looking, and here's who you should talk to, and blah, blah, blah. So I made the contacts, and they flew me up to Washington for an interview, and basically hired me. I had to go through some background checks and stuff like that. It took a while to finish all the bureaucratic stuff they had to do. But I joined VOA in 1985, and I opened a bureau for them. It was based in San Jose, Costa Rica, but I traveled around the rest of the region.
So now you basically been 10 years
out of college,
and most of that out of the country.
Yeah.
Was it ever during that time you just I'd like to just go back to America for a bit?
Not really.
No.
No, because my career was going well. I kept moving up.
Yeah.
Every time I got a new job, I made more money. I'd married a lady from Mexico. We had a daughter now in Costa Rica. And so, I don't know. I just felt like I had found my calling. And I was doing well at this job. I enjoyed it. And at the Voice of America, it was a worldwide radio network with bureaus all around the planet. So I saw opportunities to move on and go other places and do other things. And I was very happy to keep doing. I had no burning desire to come back to the States. That's for sure.
Was Costa Rica quiet around this time, or was there?
It was. Costa Rica has had a long history of being they call Switzerland of Central America, sort of peaceful, tranquil. They abolished their army in 1949 and sort of set up a different type of society, much more. They didn't have the gross differences in income disparity between the poor and the rich and all that some of the other Central American countries had. And ecologically, it's just beautiful. It's a stunning place, very, very beautiful. I didn't spend a lot of time there because that was not the idea. Basically, they put me in Costa Rica because they didn't have to pay any danger pay for me to live there.
They still want you to do the danger stuff, but they're not going to let you live.
I traveled all the time. At this time, this time, Manuel Noriega was in the news in Panama. Right. And so I was spending a lot of time in Panama, still in Nicaragua. The Contras were fighting the Sandinistas. El Salvador was still in turmoil. Guatemala would still blow up things now and again. So I'd come to Costa Rica. I would get my clothes washed and do my expense accounts and take care of paying some bills and office administrative stuff, and then go off again somewhere else. Oftentimes, I would spend maybe 6 months out of the whole year traveling on the road somewhere.
Wow.
My wife was very tolerant of me for letting me do that. But we would make up for it. At the end of the year, I would typically try to take off for at least two or 3 weeks, and we would go to Houston, visit my father, that sort of thing. Sort of just get away from the whole scene. Yeah.
So, and was that, so with you traveling around, still the whole Central America, different parts are still, fighting a lot. Were you in danger at that time at all, or not as much?
Yeah, same thing.
Same thing.
I was covering anti-Noriega riots where I once, fortunately it didn't really hurt me, but I got hit by some bird shot fired by the Panamanian troops, putting down some rioters. In my leg, I got a couple little pellets.
Yeah.
But yeah, could have been worse. I mean, got that in the face or the eyes or something. Right. But that was probably the worst thing I had to deal with. It was pretty minor. Didn't really require any serious medical treatment. Just
so still in the thick of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. How long?
I did that. I was there, based out of Costa Rica for, let me think, till 1990. Early 1990, and then I transferred back. They took me back to Washington, where I was assigned to cover the State Department beat. This was beginning in January 1990. At that time, the first George Bush was president, and James Baker was the Secretary of State.
Gotcha.
So suddenly I'm going from the war correspondent to a diplomatic correspondent.
Instead of bleeding knees, now you're in a suit dressed up.
There you go. That's right. And learning all about lots of issues that, big global, arms control issues. And this was at the kind of the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union.
Yep.
And also at that time, in August of 1990, is when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And Baker worked lots and lots of traveling to put together like a 90-nation coalition to oppose Iraq and get them out of Kuwait. An enormous diplomatic effort. So I was traveling with him all around the world all the time. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, that was on August the 1st, 1990, we were in a place called Irkutsk, Siberia. And it was a kind of a combination fishing trip and diplomatic mission between Baker and the Soviet foreign minister was named Eduard Shevardnadze. And the year before, in 1989, Baker had invited Shevardnadze to go fishing with him at Jackson Hole, Wyoming. So this was repayment for that.
And all the way to Siberia.
And there's all the way to Siberia. And there's a thing there called Lake Baikal. It is the deepest freshwater lake in the world. It's like 5,000 feet deep. Wow. It's huge. Jeez. And they went fishing on this lake. And then after their fishing trip, they had a little business meeting. And it was during that last business meeting that an American general came and whispered in Baker's ear that, hey, we've just gotten word that Iraq has crossed into Kuwait. And so Baker sent one of his chief aides with Shevardnadze to fly with Shevardnadze on his airplane back to Moscow, across Russia, to begin trying to work on a joint denunciation of that invasion by the United States and the Soviet Union. Meantime, Baker, our next leg after Siberia was to go to Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, to open diplomatic relations between the United States and Mongolia. So as we were taking off, we reporters didn't know about the Iraq invasion at the time of the end of the meeting. They had a few comments. Then we got on Baker's airplane and we're taking off to go to Mongolia. And he comes back to the press corps in the back of the airplane and says, we just gotten word about the Iraqi army bearing down on these villages in Kuwait. We don't know exactly what their intentions are, but I sent my aide Dennis Ross is flying with Shevardnadze, and we're working on this joint denunciation. And he was actually going to go to Mongolia, open diplomatic relations there, and then take a hike out into the Gobi Desert, a trek. I was really looking forward to that. He announced,
stupid Saddam.
He announced that I'm canceling the trek to the Gobi Desert, but we will go. We'll stay for 24 hours. We'll sign the paperwork, agree to open up embassies and blah blah blah, and then we're going to fly ourselves back to Moscow. By then, hopefully, they'll have finished this work on this joint denunciation. So we spent the day in Mongolia, flew back to Irkutsk in Siberia to get fuel. He had a plane The plane we flew in was actually the same plane that President Kennedy used on the day he was killed in Dallas.
Oh, okay.
That had been handed down by that time to the Secretary of State. That was now the Secretary of State's plane. It needed to be refueled. It didn't have a real long range. So we went to Irkutsk, landed the plane, a tire blew out on the plane. The Russians didn't have the right kind of jack. They had down on them. They couldn't get it lifted. Finally, they figured out something, got the tire changed. At the little airport there, they had caviar for sale. So we all spent all our travel money because we were there just hour after hour waiting for the plane to get fixed. Got back on the plane, took off, flew across Russia to Moscow, and I'm going, this is so weird. I'm flying across, the Soviet Union's not our friend. We're flying across their territory. I'm in the Secretary of State's airplane. Is this really going to work? Will they shoot us down or what? Anyway, we got to Moscow. Sure enough, they had another meeting to dot some I's and cross some T's, but the United States and the Soviet Union came out jointly denouncing the invasion of Kuwait, which was unprecedented. And, since we did cooperate with Stalin in World War II when fighting Hitler, but since that time, the Cold War set in, and man, we never agreed with them on anything. So it was really quite historic. At the time, I was under a lot of deadline pressure. We'd only had about half an hour to file our stories and take off to start heading back to Washington. It didn't hit me precisely how big a deal it was, but when Baker later wrote his memoirs, he said that's when the Cold War ended, when the United States and the Soviet Union could. And I was there. I watched it.
Yeah, and I mean, looking back, so because part of your career was covering essentially kind of ramifications of the Cold War. I mean, with communism being spread across Central America.
Correct.
I mean, how was that something that you? Because for me, the Cold War was like 5 years. That's when I was, when I knew about
was aware of it.
So for me, it wasn't like part of my lifetime.
Right.
I mean, did you think that was ever going to happen? That there was going to sort of come
that it would end? No. No. I'd never. The whole phenomenon of Gorbachev coming to power and starting to unwind the Soviet Union, I never thought anything like that would happen.
Wow.
No. I grew up in the era where we practiced drills in school. In case of bombing, we would dive under our school desks in case of, and especially growing up in Houston, there had been the Cuban Missile Crisis where they had tried to put nuclear weapons into Cuba, and we knew Houston being a big industrial port city, undoubtedly it would be a target, and so his time of the Cold War is totally different than mine, Jerry, and you don't even it doesn't even register with you.
No, that doesn't.
Yeah, for me, Cold War was like Yakov Smirnoff. I mean, it was just they started making jokes about it around my time in the mid '80s.
Yeah, right.
So it wasn't even as big of a deal. But then everything kept doing it.
Yeah.
So now with that, that's done, and then, I mean, how does your career change because of that? Is it because do things change or just
sure?
Yeah.
When President Clinton came to office, there were people writing books and things about the end of history. That things would just, we'd entered the land of milk and honey. The United States was on top. The Russians were not a constant threat to obliterate us at any moment, and nobody else could challenge us.
Yeah.
And I think we went through that all the way until 9/11. Yeah. And 9/11 kind of woke up everybody about, okay, it's not the same as being obliterated in a nuclear war. That terrorism is horrible. It's bad. It killed a lot of people, but it's not that bad. But still, there was, I think, the conflict, the Cold War era, there was some rationality. The Russians and the Americans, in some level, understood each other and understood that, what they called MAD, mutually assured destruction, kept them from ever pushing the button.
Yeah.
But now with the terrorists, they can strike anywhere, and there's not a real rationality that you can easily grasp. That most of the terrorists seem to be, a lot of them, they're well educated, they're middle class, they don't have the typical kind of grievances that you can understand. Some poor campesino in Nicaragua who's been oppressed and seen his children die of dysentery and everything else, that he'd be mad and take up a weapon. But it's hard to understand, for me at least, some of the motivation of the people we're fighting today. Yeah, things have changed, that's for sure.
And how did your career sort of end up?
Right. So after my time at the State Department, I covered that beat till 1993, and I transferred then to New Delhi, India, and became a roving correspondent around the Indian subcontinent. I covered India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. We had another bureau in Pakistan, in Islamabad. And I did go over and fill in a couple of times for when that correspondent was traveling, but I didn't cover Pakistan.
And was anything happening in India at the time?
Yeah, lots. Yeah. India was beginning to open itself up, its economy. It had a fairly closed socialistic style economy since its founding, since its independence from Britain in 1947. And it began slowly looking for more Western investment, and American companies started moving in there and that sort of thing. So there was that whole economic story. And then it has had perennial problems with Pakistan, and there was a insurrection Muslim militant movement in an area called Kashmir in the northern part of India,
where they fight over,
which is disputed territory.
Yeah.
Pakistan says it belongs to them, and there's part of it that's occupied and held by Pakistan, and another part held by India. Pakistan wants all of it, and the population of that area is mostly Muslim, but the leadership and the governance has typically been Hindu, and so it's a problem.
Yeah.
And so there was long-going insurgency and guerrilla warfare there, and it was kind of the beginning of some of my education about the whole Muslim radical terrorism movement that I didn't know a lot about before that time. So.
And then, when did you decide to hang up your reporter's book?
So after my time in India, they brought me back to Washington again, and this time, finally, they made me work in the newsroom. I'd always been roaming around and reporting on stuff, but
you didn't have a desk.
I had to pay my dues and be in the main headquarters editor for a while. I started out on the Latin America desk. I did that for about a year, and then they moved me to they call the duty editor. You sort of overseeing the entire news product. VOA put out like its own internal wire service, where we had writers writing stories based on. They would take AP report, Reuters, maybe make some phone calls, put together radio copy that was then transmitted to around all the different languages that VOA would broadcast in, and they would translate those stories into their own idiom and broadcast them. And so I was sitting in the slot, sort of overseeing that whole production for a couple of years. And then our London bureau opening came up, and I applied, and they appointed me the London correspondent. And so we moved there in the summer of 2001, like July, and got settled down, found a house to live in, got our stuff moved in, and then 9/11 happened. And so from right then on, I was covering, and the British were our strongest ally in the whole effort against the Al Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan, and then later on into Iraq. And my job in London, I would travel all around. I I did work in Afghanistan. I worked in Iraq. I went to Somalia. I went to Darfur, all around, anywhere in the Middle East. I was in Israel during the Second Intifada. Wherever there was trouble, anywhere from the western part of China all the way to Europe and Africa, they seemed to send me there. So it was a lot like when I was in Costa Rica, traveling a lot.
And now you're in your late 40s?
No, I was in my 50s.
50s.
I was 51 when I transferred out to London, and I did that for 5 years. And I retired after I was eligible for my pension. I had enough. I achieved, whatever they offered me after being London Bureau Chief wasn't good enough.
Okay.
Hard to beat, and there had been some management changes and things that I just didn't feel like I had much of a future left in what I was doing, to be honest with you. And again, I was eligible for my retirement pension, and I was able to keep my health insurance, and I'd inherited some money to where I could buy a house in San Antonio. We'd always kind of intended to come live in San Antonio because my wife being from Mexico, she has family that live out in the El Paso area. We didn't want to live over there, but they're not that far away. It's an hour's flight.
Kind of in the middle of everything for your family.
And it's okay, and there's enough Mexican Spanish culture here and all for my wife to be happy, and it fits very well, this being here in San Antonio. So we've been quite content to be here. I did start getting involved in the SPJ. In the last couple of years, I've been on the board, and I've been also visiting campuses and working with students, promoting our scholarship program, and trying to drum up interest in that and get people to apply for it.
So it's, wow, that's a lot. Let's put it that way. Wow. Well, we've, like I said, me and Jerry, we've seen you quite a bit, but it's nice to really dissect the whole history of yourself, since it's, such an interesting time all across the globe.
And I'm sure we only got a piece of it.
Yeah, there's a lot more to say, but I think I hit the highlights. Yeah. So I hope the people watching this enjoy it.
I think they will, especially with everything that's going on right now. That's a lot of excitement for journalists.
Right. If I could say one thing to the student journalists who might be watching this is, if you can see from my career path, when I was a Trinity student, I had no idea that I would end up doing all these things. But I did equip myself with the knowledge and the skills to go out there and practice journalism and do it. Try to be as excellent as you can. You're going to make mistakes sometimes, like I did with the box scores at the Express News on the baseball game. But just keep learning. Remember, all the tools you're dealing with, all the computers and everything, all this technology we're using today will probably change. But these are just tools. The things you're learning that are important are how to interview people, how to gather information, how to track down sources, the process of gathering and packaging your news stories. Those are the things you'll use for the rest of your life. And all the other little bits, they'll change, and that's no big deal. You just have to keep up. So
that's all it is.
That's my advice. Yeah.
It's all about those fundamentals.
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah, good.
Thank you, Mike,
Sure thing. Thank you, Oscar.
coming in.
Sure. Thank you.
All right. And that's going to be it for us. It's spring break for me and Jerry.
Great.
Oh, yeah.
Well, enjoy your spring break. Yeah.
But still visit mesquite-news.com for all the news about A&M San Antonio. You can follow Jerry Quijano on Twitter at Jerry Quijano. Follow me on Twitter at OriginGamer1, and follow the Mesquite at the Mesquite on Twitter and Instagram. Mesquite News on Facebook. All right, so we're off next week. So when we come back, we'll talk to you further and have some more news for you. See you.